This chapter, we're going to focus on communication, culture, and diversity. So, to start things off, we need to have a working definition of what culture is and to kind of basically understand what it is that culture is and how communication plays a role in that. So basically, culture is the rules of living and functioning in society. So we'll discuss how there's different cultures all over the world, and depending upon which culture you're in, there's different rules based on that culture. There's different ways of greeting people. There's different ways of interacting with people. There's different expectations in different contexts, whether that's the way that you act in your family or the way that you act in the workplace or the way that you act in public. We're all kind of familiar of this, but there's different cultures all over the place. And being a competent communicator is very crucial in order to understand a new culture, in order to learn those rules, values, and customs of each one. And this is done through socialization. Socialization is the process of experiencing these different attitudes, perceptions, emotions, and communication choices within cultures. This is how socialization can be viewed kind of like learning. When you start a new job, or when you go to a new school, or you move away to college, or you go visit somewhere across the country, or you go visit somewhere across the globe that you've never been. There's this assimilation process that typically takes place. You're socialized into that new university, or you're socialized into that new town that you moved into. This is how you get to know, kind of quote unquote, the way things are around here. It's the way that you're communicated. These are the rules. It's the way that you're taught. This is how things are around here. These are the norms. And it's all these experiences that shape our attitudes, perceptions, emotions, and communication choices within any given culture. Every culture socializes people from the day that you're born into a particular culture, and from that moment you're born throughout your entire life, there's this continual socialization process that kind of keeps you up to speed with what the rules of the culture are. Diversity is the unique differences in people. So diversity takes place within culture, and it definitely takes place between cultures. When we think of diversity, we often think of people from different cultures interacting together or working together or being in one location together. Like Western Michigan is considered a diverse university because we have individuals from all different cultures there. You're going to hear a lot about workplaces striving to be diverse because they want a broad range of differences and opinions and values and views on things. And one theory that was constructed by a professor here at Western, Dr. Orby's co-cultural communication theory, this gets at this focuses on communication among people from a variety of different cultures. And what his research has demonstrated is there's a lot of different choices that people make and a lot of different outcomes associated with how they communicate when learning a new culture. Some people assimilate, meaning they adapt really well and they can kind of blend in with the culture and kind of act the way they're supposed to and pick up on all those cultural codes. Other people push themselves away, they separate. Other people kind of co-adopt. I mean, there's a lot of different choices and a lot of different ways that people communicate when they're in a variety of different cultures. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you might want to check out Dr. Orby's theory, co-cultural communication. So there's some big components of cultures that kind of let us know what the culture is all about. One of the big categories is cultural rituals. These are practices, behaviors, celebrations, and tradition common to people, organization, and institutions. So if you think here in the United States, on that I guess country level, at the level of our nation, we have rituals. I mean, we celebrate specific holidays such as Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. I mean, those are pretty big staples for the United States, whereas in a lot of other cultures, they don't celebrate those holidays at all. In the United States, in some house, I mean, these can happen on a variety of levels. They can be national, like those holidays I just listed. Some families have rituals. You can look at a family itself as a culture. Where maybe you have dinner on Sunday nights every Sunday as a family. That might be a ritual. These things aren't necessarily ones that every single person has to agree to, but at some point there's a group of people that all agree to these different things. These can happen again at the level of your nation, state. They happen within the organizations that we belong to, the institutions that we belong to, such as college, church, those types of things. We have rituals. We have things that we do over and over again, or we do them annually, or we do them weekly. The key with rituals is they're repeated, and it's something that's institutionalized that we do over and over again, and that says a lot about um, our culture. We have jargon. This is language specific to an organization or profession. Whenever you go to the doctor's office or you speak with a lawyer, these people are experts in this particular area. They have their own culture and they have their own jargon that surrounds this stuff, that kind of encapsulates this culture. So they use their own language that we may not understand completely, but they do. It's a specific language to that culture. And I mean, this happens in countries, states. I mean, if you think about pop. Most of us around here in Southwest Michigan area, we call it pop, but in other places it's soda, other places it's Coke. So that's just a specific type of jargon in itself. And then storytelling is used as an aid to understand context or culture. If you think about it, we tell stories a lot to socialize children into things. Parents use storytelling to teach their kids lessons as they're growing up. We hear storytelling all the times in books and in TV shows growing up as children that tell us about rules that we're supposed to follow, or guidelines, or the way that we're supposed to think about how we're supposed to act if we're a man or if we're a woman, or if we're this age or if we're that age, or what it means to be a kid versus being a young adult, so on and so forth. We use storytelling in a variety of capacities to help us understand cultures. We have stories about the United States. I mean, if you think about, even how this country was founded. I mean, those are all stories, how the United States came to be. I mean, if you think about the civil rights movement, we hear stories about that. If you think about the Industrial Revolution, we hear stories about that. If you think about things like the American Dream, we have stories that surround that. So storytelling is also another part of culture, and it's used to help people understand culture and context of that culture. So it's important to be aware of culture. Cultural awareness is super important as you start going. It's not just, some of you might be thinking, well, I'm never really going to go somewhere. I'm always going to live in the United States, or I'm always going to live in Michigan, or I'm going to go back to where I came from after I go to college. You may not necessarily explore a whole lot of different cultures, but there will be individuals that enter your life that you will interact with at some point that are from different cultures. So in order for you to succeed in any type of personal, social, or especially professional context, you need to be aware and sensitive to the differences between yourselves and others. So it's important that you reflect on, how was I raised? What are the norms in this particular area that I grew up in? How do we, do things around here compared to how is it in different areas? Because it's important that you don't just say, oh, well, the way everybody else is doing it is wrong. The way that I've done it is right. That's not the case. It's a much bigger world out there with a huge variety of cultural rules and rituals, and it's important to be aware of them. And it's going to affect how you can communicate. If you can communicate effectively when encountering differences of ethnicity, race, language, religion, so on and so forth, it's essential to be an engaged citizen, and an educated and engaged citizen. It's important to be aware of culture, because as time goes on, it's only going to become more, we're only going to become more and more diverse across the globe. So it's important that we are aware of these things in order to communicate effectively when talking with these people from different cultural backgrounds. So now let's get into some of the dimensions of culture and some of the differences. First, we have high versus low context culture. So in high context culture, this is where spoken words are less important than the context. So what we mean by that is instead of focusing just word by word on what people are saying or message or sentence by sentence what's in their in whatever it is that they're saying, there's a lot of other stuff that's considered. We consider the relationship of the two individuals talking, the personal context. We consider status, influence, and knowledge of the other person. We really, in these types of cultures, they really focus a lot more on everything that's at play. You could only say 3 or 4 words in an interaction, but it's going to communicate all sorts of deeper, more meaningful messages based on what is surrounding it, based on the context. Countries like Iraq, Japan, Korea, these are much more high context cultures where the amount of words that you say don't matter as much as what is going on within this entire context of this interaction. What are the relationships? Who are the people talking? What do I know about you? Are you showing respect or not? All these things are considered much more. Whereas in the United States, we're much more of a low context culture. So what we really focus on more than anything as we focus on information and logical argument. We tend to separate relationships from verbal messages and to really focus on what it is that's in the content. We focus on the words a lot more. We focus on the sentences being said. We're very, very low context. We don't always consider all these other things at play in a communication context. We focus specifically on what are the words being said, and that's more of a low context culture. We also have individualism versus collectivism. In the United States, for example, we're very individualistic. That's where the whole American dream comes from. That's where you pull up from your bootstraps. You can do whatever you want in this country. You can accomplish your dreams. We have a lot of those cultural values in our country because we're very individualistic. We put a lot of emphasis on individuals rather than groups. We focus on individual accomplishment a lot more than group accomplishment. And we just strive and focus on our individual goals, our individual accomplishments, so on and so forth. Whereas collectivist cultures, they're way more about what's best for the group. They're concerned about group cohesion and loyalty to the group rather than how one individual can strive to become the best they can be. Collectivist cultures focus much more on what's best for the community, what's best for the family, what's best for the organization I work in, so on and so forth. They focus a lot more on what's best for the collective, for the group. Whereas on the other side, individualistic cultures focus much more on what's good for the individual. Power distances vary, and you can kind of view these on spectrums as well, from high power distance to low power distance. And what this is the perceived equality or inequality felt between people in certain cultural or social contexts. So, in some countries, there's a very, very high power distance, meaning there are status differences. There's people that belong to royal families that will never marry, a regular citizen, or it's kind of like that traditional, if you think about like way back in the day, like kings and queens and prince and princesses, all the royal family type stuff, they would never associate with like the peasants of the town or whatever. There's a huge power distance there. Those people aren't allowed to communicate with one another. They're not allowed to form relationships with one another. There's huge standards on who you're supposed to hang out with, who you're supposed to, be romantically involved with, who you're supposed to associate with, based on do they have the same amount of power as you. If they don't have the same amount of power as you, you shouldn't associate with those individuals. But there's also low power distance cultures where that stuff doesn't really matter. This again will happen at the national level of a country, level of a state, level of an organization. But for an example, in organizations, there's often organizations that have low power distance because the CEO will, openly listen to feedback from a janitor, or from, a temp, or from an entry level employee. So for example, you could have somewhere like Google that really believes in a low power distance where regardless of what your position is, everybody kind of has equal input to the organization. Whereas a place or an organization or a business with a high power distance, it's like there's a strict chain of command, there's a strict hierarchy, and you don't jump over that hierarchy to talk to people that are in way higher power distances than you. Uncertainty avoidance, there's cultures that handle change and they accept uncertainty and they're okay with trying new things. And there's other cultures that kind of stick to how things are and how things have always been in order to avoid uncertainty. So some cultures are okay with being unsure of certain things and trying new things. Other cultures are much more about sticking to what we know, sticking to the traditional way of doing things, and let's really not change things up a whole lot. There's masculinity versus femininity. Masculinity is described by traits connected to being assertive, competitive, and aggressive. Some cultures are much more masculine, and then we have femininity. This is a focus on being caring or compassionate towards others. And again, this is a spectrum. I mean, all cultures kind of have a little bit of both of these, but it depends on the culture. The culture kind of determines which side of the scale you lean on a little bit more. Some organizations are hyper masculine. There's certain occupations that are you can look at an occupation as a culture. For instance, sales. Sales is typically a very masculine type of occupation to get into, where human resources is considered more of a feminine occupation to get into. So again, this is on a spectrum, and this isn't linked necessarily to sex. So masculinity is not synonymous with being a male. Femininity is not synonymous with being a woman. You can be a masculine female. You can be a feminine male. These are gendered prescriptions. These are socially constructed cultural value dimensions. These aren't things that we're inherently born with. This is what we're taught and what we're socialized into. But again, at the cultural level, you have some cultures that are more masculine, much more aggressive and competitive and being assertive. And then you have some cultures that are feminine, much more focused on caring and compassion towards other people. Time orientations vary amongst cultures. There's long-term versus short-term time orientation. So long-term is where you emphasize processes for accomplishing tasks, and short-term is all about efficiency, production, and fast results. So in long-term cultures, it's okay if it takes longer to do something as long as you're doing it right. It's more about quality, not quantity. In short-term cultures, it's more about quantity and less about quality. It's how fast you can get things done, how efficient we can get things done, how much we can produce in a short amount of time. And you'll notice in the United States, there's a blend of these depending on what it is that you're doing, what organization you might belong to, what the industry is, so on and so forth. But these things do vary. So cultural competence is related to communication competence, but it basically gets at the level of knowledge a person has about others who differ in some way in comparison to self. So it's basically how well can you understand people from different cultures, and instead of just making judgments and being scared to try to learn more, you really try to gain that knowledge of how things are done. What are the cultural rules associated with where you come from? What are the cultural rules of this organization that I just started working at? What are the cultural rules of this college I just started attending? What are the cultural rules in Germany when I'm visiting for the summer? It's just how things are done around here, and how well can I learn those things and have that knowledge so I can communicate competently. And we often need to do this through perception checking, and this is the process of asking others to get more informed sense of understanding. And often we feel very embarrassed to do this, right? When you're in a new organization or a new culture, a new country, a new state, new town, whatever it might be, we're often a little embarrassed and reluctant to ask others, like, okay, what does this mean? Or why did you do that? Or why do you communicate like this? Or why do you interact with people like this? But it's important that we do that so that we can learn that information. And it gives us a more informed sense of understanding, and then we're able to operate and communicate more effectively. So it's always important to check your interpretation with others before drawing conclusions. So if you're in a new country, if you're going to Bangladesh and you see, two individuals, a woman and a man, interact a certain way, and it's something you've never seen before and you don't understand it, maybe you should ask somebody that does know the answer before you just kind of make a conclusion about it. Try to gain an expert's opinion on what just happened so you know. And again, Use a more direct approach so that you ask people you're communicating with about the culture that they're in. Ask people that know about the culture so you can be aware of what the rules are within that culture. There's some imperatives associated with this. Self-awareness and being ethical are huge. Um, when you learn more about other cultures, you learn more about your own. By learning what is different, by learning new things, by learning new ways that people communicate and interact, you learn about how that compares to the culture you already belong to. And we can't truly understand our own culture until we're able to compare it to others. We can stand here all day long and say, this is what America's all about. This is America. We believe in these things. This is what it means to be an American. You can sit on that patriotic high horse all day long and be proud of your country, and that's great. But you're never going to have a full understanding of what the United States is truly all about until you go to a few different countries and see how we compare to them and see how we're different than them and see how rules are different. You can be all about Western Michigan University. You can have all sorts of Bronco pride, but you don't really understand everything about what it is to be a Bronco or what it means to go to Western Michigan University until you go visit Central or State or Notre Dame or, God forbid, Ohio State. So again, being self-aware gives you the ability to compare your culture to others, your cultural background to other people's cultural background, and then it really helps you distinguish and see the differences between the two. Being ethical is also important. This should guide us to do what is right versus what is wrong. And we need to consider the value differences in culture, the value differences in cultures and how those are different, and how different values are placed on different things, so on and so forth. So again, it's important for us to be informed and educated so that we can act ethically. We're going to talk a little bit about diversity and some of the different dimensions of diversity. The first one being gender influences. So again, I briefly talked about this, but there's a difference between sex and gender. Gender is psychological and emotional characteristics of an individual. These are socially constructed. We are socialized into believing what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, how to act as a man, how to act as a woman, what roles men should take in the household, what roles women should take in the household, so on and so forth. These are socially constructed guidelines about what it means to act masculinely and what it means to act femininely. Sex is biological. We are born with it. We are born male, female, or trans, whatever the situation. This is just the biological connection. Gender is social. We communicate what it means to be, how to act this way, so on and so forth. And we can either be masculine, feminine, and androgynous. Masculinity, again, is not directly linked to being a male. Femininity, again, is not directly linked to being a female. Androgyny is a fancy term for a blend of both, where you're both masculine and feminine. Again, these things vary. They exist on a spectrum. And then there's rapport talk versus report talk. Rapport talk is cooperative messages used to establish connection. This is often associated with femininity. Report talk is information-based messages used to establish status and gain power. This is more associated with masculinity. We have ethnicity and race. Race is based on physical characteristics, and ethnicity is based on shared history, identity, geography, and culture. All right, so these are two different things. Race and ethnicity are not synonymous. Race is strictly physical characteristics. It's skin color, it's hairstyle, it's all these different physical things that we can see. Ethnicity, however, is about a shared history, identity, geography, or culture. So you can't necessarily determine somebody's ethnic background just by looking at them. You might be able to figure out a race or ascribe a race to them to kind of help you figure them out a little bit. But ethnically, you have to communicate to understand these things. You cannot predict somebody's ethnicity just by looking at them. You have to communicate in order to know these things. And then there's also language differences as well. There's accents. This is how we pronunciate words differently. This is the difference between the Midwestern accent, the Southern accent, the Jersey accent, and an accent way out west. So again, there's different accents and there's dialect. This additionally refers to differences in vocabulary and syntax. And again, this is kind of like the pop example I gave earlier. Pop versus soda versus Coke, depending on where you're at in the United States. There's religion and spirituality. and individuals may behave differently based on their religions or spiritual beliefs. So it's important for us to not just bash people from different religious backgrounds, but instead to try to understand why they believe in the things that they do and why they behave the way that they do. And then people with disabilities. This is also an example of diversity. It can help you support fair treatment and be respectful to these individuals. We have this huge problem in the United States about how to communicate with individuals with disabilities, and often we're condescending and very, very rude. So again, being culturally competent in this area can lead to fair treatment and respectful communication with people with this background. And then sexual orientation. So we talked about gender, we talked about biological sex, and then there's sexual orientation. All three of these things are different. And this refers to your identity based on who you are attracted to sexually. So again, we need to be respectful of this and not just assume males like females, females like males. It's much more complicated and complex than that. So don't inadvertently out somebody. Don't share somebody's information about what their sexual orientation is if they are not trying to share that information, and avoid being heterosexist. And basically what this means is a viewer assumption that everyone is heterosexual. We have a tendency to do this as well in the United States, where we just assume, because we've been socialized into believing that heterosexuality is a norm, everyone is supposed to be heterosexual, so on and so forth. That's not the case. There's many individuals clearly that are not heterosexual, so it's important for us to recognize that, be aware of that, and respect individuals that aren't heterosexual. So again, being aware of sexual orientation is very important. Another example of diversity. So what are some barriers? Quickly to finish things up. Stereotypes. We all know what this is, but basically it's popular beliefs amongst groups of people, perceptions of others belonging to other ethnic or social groups. This is where we basically categorize people because it makes things easier for us to understand stuff that we don't understand. Instead of doing that, instead of stereotyping, instead of instantly grouping people based on one thing that they've done or one thing that they said or one way that they wear clothes, instead of stereotyping, we should really strive more and more to get to know people on an individual basis instead of throwing them into those stereotypes that we have. And then at a worse level is prejudice and discrimination. This is prejudice or dislike or hatred toward a particular group just because they belong to that particular group. We don't even really take our time to get to know the person as an individual. We just associate them with a group that we don't like, so then we show hatred towards them. And discrimination is the verbal and nonverbal actions that demonstrate or corroborate prejudiced attitudes. So prejudice is basically just the belief, it's just the thinking, it's just the view or the dislike. Discrimination is actually taking actions to demonstrate your prejudice. And ethnocentrism, this is a key term to know and a key thing to avoid. And basically what this gets at is when you run into somebody from a different culture, you just say that what they're doing is wrong because it's not how your own culture does it. You negatively judge them, or you negatively judge aspects of another culture based on the standards of yours. It's like placing the cultural norms associated with the United States. You can't travel to Australia or Germany or the Netherlands or Denmark or wherever you might be going. You can't take that rule set that you've learned here in the United States about how to behave and how to act and take it to one of those countries and use it, because it's just not going to work. Those rules are not going to be the same. Those norms are not going to be the same. So it's important, instead of you just saying, "Oh, well, that's how you do it over there in Indonesia," I think that's freaking stupid. That's not how we do it here in the United States. That's just ignorant. That's just the ignorant way of doing it. You need to be aware of different cultures and how things do, and how cultures and people from different cultures think and communicate differently, instead of just instantly assuming, "Oh, you're doing it wrong, I'm doing it right, I don't want to listen, I'm going to be ignorant." That's just ignorant. People who view their culture as dominant are unwilling to learn and not open up to the ideas of other cultures. Simply said, just being ignorant. So again, be aware that the rules and how things operate in your own culture, that's not the same anywhere else across the globe. And you're going to run into people from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds in your life. So it's important to try to understand why, instead of just judging. And then hate speech, we all are aware of what this is. This is uncivil discourse. Phrases, terms, cartoons, and entire campaigns used to humiliate people based on their age, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, and social class.